putting my stuff in my water so that I can actually drink it.
I live off Crystal Lake. In fact, that and
I
pink
hate
lemonade.
water.
Yeah, those are the two flavors I do.
Okay, red lights
As
on.
long as it has flavor. All right. Welcome. Let's go ahead and start our meeting tonight with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. And I'm going to go a little out of order on our agenda. I understand that we have our new city manager here, Brant Hansen.
Yes.
Brant, I'm putting you on the spot. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
You want to tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. What's a little bit about myself? So I'm from Davis County. I grew up in Clinton. I'm a graduate of Northridge High. Go Knights.
We'll forgive you.
So yeah, I grew up in Davis County. I'm coming from Ephraim. I've been the city manager of Ephraim just shy of 5 years. Prior to that, I was in Yuma, Arizona. I don't know if you know where Yuma is, but it's on the border of California and Mexico. Very large city. It was a great opportunity down there. I was a management analyst. I've graduated from Weber State with a bachelor's in political science and history. I've graduated from University of Southern California, USC, with my master's in public administration and master's in international relations. I have my wife and 1 2-year-old, and we just started our family. But yeah, that's a little bit about me.
We are delighted to have you.
Thank you.
Not to cause you any concern, but you have very big shoes to fill.
The bar has been set pretty high.
Yes.
But I'm up for the challenge. How about that?
Well, welcome. We're
I just want to
delighted.
say thank you as a planning commission. This is by far, I think, one of the most critical boards that a city can have in the land use and what we deal with. So I appreciate you taking the time to volunteer your time to do this. So thank you. And I need as much knowledge and information as I possibly can. So if any of you have any information or questions for me, please let me know. I'm here. So.
Great.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me the time.
All right, and one other item that is not on our agenda, but has just been informally brought to my attention, that Cassie Younger is going to be leaving us, and this may be her last day.
Can we vote on that? Is that?
I know.
Please do vote, because mine apparently didn't count.
So, Cassie, I think you've been an incredible asset to our city, and you are going to be very sorely missed, my friends.
Thank you so much. I think all other planning commissions have a very high bar next to you guys. It's been a pleasure working with all of you.
Don't be a stranger. You know where we are.
Oh, I do.
You're welcome to
Yeah,
come
there's a
in.
Maverick that needs to be redone right here. So
Yeah. No.
Maybe I'll see you on the table on the other side of
that's
the.
right.
Well, thank you very
here.
much for all of your efforts and your hard work.
Their entitlements manager.
Yeah, we'll have to chat afterwards. Looks like it's
Yeah.
come full circle, Tom.
Yeah. All right. Well, you'll be sorely missed. You are leaving a very big hole as well, and very big shoes to fill. So,
Thank you.
all right. Thanks so much, Cassie. Okay. Getting back to our agenda. So, I've asked Commissioner Daly to give a prayer of thought tonight, so I'll turn the time over to him.
Thank you. Chair Heyman told me that since the agenda was light tonight, I could have an hour, was that?
I think that's a blatant misrepresentation, but that's all right. didn't I say that you could wax a little poetic?
You
I
did.
think was what I said.
Yeah, you did,
Yeah.
but that's okay. Anyway, so for my thought tonight, I'm going to continue with kind of my theme that I've used in the last few times that I've given a thought, which is not so much, some of you do a really great job of pulling out these planning related quotes and thoughts and whatever else, and that's not my thing. So I'm gonna continue with a little bit of a history lesson and kind of the history of some planning in Centerville and some previous projects in Centerville. Probably about a month or so ago, we learned a little bit about the Centerville Dual Creek Irrigation Company. And so I decided that I would break out my old book of the Weber River Basin, and then also go back to my other favorite source of history, which is the Davis County Clipper. And little quick history of water in Centerville. So when the first settlers arrived, they settled just to the south side of Dual Creek, and started irrigating. In the earliest days of Centerville, the water rights and the management of the water was actually done by the church and by specifically the bishop. And they would try and set out some fair guidelines for that. When Centerville was divided into 2 wards, the Centerville First Ward controlled Dual Creek, and then the Centerville Second Ward took Bernard Creek, Ricks Creek, and Parish Creek, and they controlled those ones. Then in 1900, so it was July 3rd, 1900, the Centerville Dual Creek Irrigation Company was incorporated to try and formalize some of the control of the water that came out of Centerville Canyon, Dual Creek, which was actually a pretty big step because that helped to formalize a lot of the management of the water that was there. In fast forwarding 15 more years, Centerville, we talked about this a little bit before, Centerville was incorporated in 1915 in order to get water for the town. The Dual Creek Irrigation Company sold 10% of their water to the city for $1,600. The irrigation company decided to use that $1,600 to do piping for a lot of the distribution. It had been open ditches up to that point, and they estimated at the time that they lost 40% of the water from seepage and evaporation. So by piping it, you could keep that 40%. So for them, giving up 10% of the water to keep 40% was a really good deal. So then fast forward a little bit more, and in the 50s, the initiative was for the Weber Basin Water District to come along. And in 1952, Centerville City almost unanimously, 174 for and 3 against, voted to participate in the Weber Basin Water District. And that's what ran the aqueduct that goes across the hillside up above, put in a series of reservoirs above there. And that was actually a pretty good thing for Centerville as well, because before that, the Centerville Dual Creek Irrigation Company used what we call the dikes, the bowl area, the ATV bowl area as a water storage area. And that was good, except that over a couple of decades of that water actually seeped down and started coming into people's basements down below. So kind of near the cemetery in that area. So by getting rid of that as a water storage area, that helped the city to do it a different way. So that's kind of the history of water in Centerville. Really short, brief background. Any questions?
Will you give the last name of the 3 people that voted against?
Yeah, can we?
No, that's funny.
Hintsy, wasn't there a Hintsy on there?
I think it was Randy Randall.
Himself.
I don't know if that's necessarily true, because one of the founding members of the Centerville Dual Creek Irrigation Company, the vice president was M.H. Randall.
Yeah, that's true.
So
That's true.
Wow.
In 1950, they only had 177 people in Centerville
that voted.
that voted.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. That's always fascinating. Thank you very much for digging into the
Yeah, no problem.
research on that. Okay, moving along. First item on our agenda is to review and summarize the previous March 13th work session with the City Council and to discuss how to proceed forward with amendments to the Main Street overlay. I know that some of us were not able to attend that meeting, so I think that this will be helpful to get us all on the same page, hopefully, with the City Council. So I will turn the time over to staff.
Thank you, Chair Heyman. So what I've tried to do, maybe set the background to it, is we held the work session with the City Council. I looked at the notes and some minutes and tried to assimilate in a rough draft skeleton concepts that I heard from the meeting. I did think later, subsequent to the memo, that there's a couple of other things that need to be added. But what I started doing, since we were trying to hustle the schedule, is take some of those ideas and formulate them into some statements and concepts about, I borrowed some from the existing general plan that were pertinent, and tried to craft a few others. And so I created those statements as a base point for discussion. In the memo, though, I stepped back from what we heard and just wanted to highlight, I think, some critical questions that were brought up and in attempt to come to a conclusion of a direction, and then some follow-up questions at the end of the memo to say, these are things I'm not quite sure where we're at and what direction we're going. All of this is culminated into this memo. The purpose is to have the commission weigh in on some of these basic fundamentals, which I spell really well, but get a baseline. And the purpose of that is when you come to approach a general plan, you're trying to encapsulate what you're starting from and which direction you're going. And we'll build off of these statements, your purpose and directions and so forth. If we get to a point where you feel comfortable in this document, the idea is that staff would immediately move forward to start drafting some language. But we also committed, if I recall that night, that we'd send our conclusions up to the city council for at least them to be able to communicate back, even if it's just to staff of, hey, I thought this and I thought that, so that I can report later to the commission. But if we want to start crafting language, it's something we've got to, if we're going to keep to the timeline, get going on. So I hope that tonight you will go through, add, edit, modify, share some things. Like one thing since the memo that I didn't put in my recollection, thinking of it at 3:30 in the morning, is it's more of a detail than a broad-based statement, but it is somewhat broad, that there was mentioning of a difference between the east side and the west side of Main Street, and I didn't include that. So I'm thinking there might be some other things that you came away with, and hope you share that with me. So I really started out, the fundamental questions were, the general plan looks at Main Street as the heart of the city, it's unique. The old plan talked about maybe it's deteriorating, needs some restoration, revitalization. That's the impetus of the 2008 effort to craft the actual corridor plan. Instead of just leaving it to the neighborhood plans, we crafted a corridor plan, and then we implemented ideas of that corridor plan in the zoning ordinance. What I heard in quick summary is yes, it's part of the character of the city. It is part of our history. But it's not a traditional downtown. It's not seen as the commercial hub. Parish Lane is seen as more of the commercial hub. And we talked about soft commercial, which was a really not defined term. So I'm trying to encapsulate what that really means. And I think that goes back to the questions yet to be is, what are we trying to do? What's the real aim? Are we tackling soft commercial as an existing? Are we expanding it a little bit? Because this is concept that you really can't draft future if land uses aren't a part of the discussion. So that's why we were hoping that land uses would begin to do that. So I think we need to think about that. And then the other element is the recommendation of staff, the process, and some of the elements of it. We could be very simple and just go back to the old plans and modify it and just rescind everything that's associated since 2008. My recommendation is we probably ought to preserve those to some extent, because I think it is a corridor, not just a neighborhood. So you could get lost in one side of the neighborhood plan versus the other side of the neighborhood plan and not really encapsulate what the corridor is supposed to function. So I think we should still maintain a corridor plan. After that, once we have a corridor plan, it's a zoning ordinance. And there's two approaches to it that I show in the memo. We could just simply reformat and reconfigure the zoning ordinance, not keeping it intact, but take that section of the zoning ordinance, treat it as a corridor district, use the overlay, and add and subtract as we see that overlay functions. Or we could rescind an overlay and maybe step back to set the setting of the thought pattern. A base zoning for Main Street is commercial medium. That's that fundamental district. You know, you have your commercial districts, you have residential districts, and there's varying degrees of intensity based on, you know, commercial medium, commercial high, commercial very high, same with industrial. That's the base zoning. The overlay is a system where you can maintain base zoning because you can say, okay, this is the fundamental commercial area, but Parish Lane functions a little different in a commercial area than Pages Lane, just throwing examples out. So you can throw and say, hey, Parish Lane has a little different attributes, so we'll use an overlay to enhance those attributes. Now, frankly, in Parish Lane, we don't use an overlay. We have a performance standard where you have your base zoning of CVH and CH, but we have a defined corridor and we add design guidelines to it, and that's a performance-based rather than an overlay. So that's, I think, your choices. We can still maintain an overlay over the top of the CM zone and call out some unique things. An example that the current overlay did is single-family homes is not a permitted use in the CM, but with the overlay, it becomes a permitted use in the CM. So the overlay lets you add some things or subtract some things. You can include performance inside the overlay. You can take performance design guidelines and drop the overlay. So those are the questions that I'm trying to raise in the report. So at this point, it's really I tried to provide some statements. You can look at them, you know, alter, modify, tell us what you think. But I think we also need to start thinking about how we're going to approach, should we keep the corridor plan, yes or no? And then maybe some preliminary ideas that we ought to be looking at for the zoning. Is it an overlay? Is it a performance standard? So hopefully that makes sense. If it's not clear to you, then ask me again and I'll ask Cassie to tell you what I was thinking.
Very nice. Thank you very much, Corey. The one thing that I didn't see is encapsulated, and one thing that I recall talking about is that there was some discussion at the work session by city council members that were at least open to the possibility of some residential, high-end residential, and in connection with that east-west discussion, I think that there were several council members that suggested that they might be able to get on board with 6 units per acre on the east side, 8 units per acre on the west side. And I think that that's another opportunity for us to consider revitalizing that area if they're willing to look at residential or maybe even like a mixed residential commercial type analysis, which seems a little bit more in line with the soft commercial. I'm still not 100% sure on what soft commercial is.
But it could encapsulate that.
Right.
So yeah, that's a good point. Maybe a statement about a transitioning use concept. And we can flush out, if that transition is going to happen, we could flush out the timing and immediacy of a transitional nature, such as converting some to residential. Where do we start? What is it?
Yeah, I do like this idea, though, of maybe redefining what our corridor is and doing it just from Porter to Parish, as opposed to going all the way to Pages. I do think that that section of Main Street is 2 distinct chunks.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, if you open that up to residential and that overlay, it's for the entire corridor, right? So technically the whole thing could become residential, or can you limit it to I mean, I don't know how you would limit it, but.
Yeah, you know, obviously the shrinking of the corridor makes it a little bit more precarious in what you define it, but, you know, so that may not lend itself to where it starts, but so you could apply it to the whole corridor or a portion of the corridor, because if you think of the overlay, it divided a much larger corridor into different rooms, is what we call them, or segments. Okay. And you could say, well, the west side is better for this versus the east side. You could say these 2 block areas is better than the civic district, and converting the old civic district into residential. So I think the answer is both. It's a little bit of both. It just becomes more precarious on your approach to it.
Let me tell you what my takeaways were from the meeting, and those of you who are in attendance, let me know if you felt differently. I felt that several of our city council members, I mean, it was very clear to me that they don't love the overlay as it exists now. And there's a real push that we need to change that overlay. I think that they feel like it's very restrictive and it's stifling what people can do with their businesses. In terms of having to particularly pull their buildings forward to the front end of the street, and I'm sensing a lot of resistance from that. So the feedback that I took away was that we want to change the overlay and probably want to put some design guidelines on it, but open it up so that it's not quite so difficult for businesses to comply with it. And maybe we'll allow some soft commercial with or without, we don't know, design guidelines, and maybe we'll allow some residential, higher end residential with the distinction on the east-west side. But that they don't love the 10 to 15 foot limitations between buildings along that corridor. So sort of open it up a little bit more, maybe allow a couple of more things in, maybe allow some residential, maybe put in some soft guidelines, design guidelines, but otherwise loosen the reins on what property owners are forced to do along that corridor to update their property. Is that, those of you who were there, is that sort of the gist?
That's what I thought as well. I think they felt like maybe it wasn't being improved or developed because the landowners didn't think it was worth putting in all of that effort to bring it up to code to make that improvement. And if we lighten that a little bit, then maybe they would.
Well, and I think
Promote some development.
I wasn't there obviously a couple weeks ago, but I think that we need to revisit those design standards anyway, because we've talked about this before as a commission. The Matt's Place, Bamberger building, whatever it's called, was built according to those standards, and while they did what we said, I don't think that's what was meant, right? Like, the result of that building, what we got out of that building was the back of the building is on Main Street, basically, right? I don't think that was the intent of the design guidelines, but they did it, right? I mean, they met the guidelines, but is that really what we wanted? So I think we need to revisit those anyway to say, okay, maybe don't do it like this, but let's see if we can figure out some way to get what we mean, not just get that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, however, I think that would require more control and perhaps more of what the city council didn't want, at least, and granted, Tammy Fillmore was not there. And I think Tammy would not support the general sense that you outlined, which I think was very accurate.
But wasn't Tammy on the planning commission at the time?
You know, it was even before her time at the planning commission.
Was
Oh,
it?
wait, right?
She was on the planning commission forever, though.
Oh, was she?
Yeah, she may have been early stint on the planning commission. I'd have to check.
Yeah.
But I would almost think that maybe, well, that's funny, you say we need more guidelines or whatever. I almost think maybe less, because then we can say, let people do what they want with the building instead of us telling them it's got to be so many feet away from Main Street and it's got to be this, that, and whatever else, and they interpret it like that. You know what I mean? So give them a little more flexibility so that they can do what they want.
My guess on that one is the market was asking, I mean, they're saying most of our customers aren't walking up on Main Street. So putting our pedestrian access up on the street, which the code, I think, had the intent of doing, just didn't work with what they were. So they said, okay, well, yeah, ideally we would like our parking out front. You know, most, I think, retail or that type of use likes that. But we can shove the building up and put the parking and just kind of reverse it, like you said. So I would guess that more flexibility would probably result in a much less pedestrian-friendly built environment on Main Street, but I could be wrong.
You know, one of the things that they talked about at our joint session was the idea that we would push up buildings in order to facilitate the tracks going through, you know, the light rail going down Main Street, which is always, I have always understood that one of the reasons that we were pushing up buildings against the street was to make it more pedestrian-friendly and also to disincentivize UDOT from essentially
marching back,
making that a larger road, right, and making it a bigger thoroughfare to keep speeds down, speeds down along that way, because we do have kids and things that walk that way. So I was sort of surprised when I heard that, and I don't know if it's true or not, because I wasn't involved in that effort at the time, but my understanding has always been push the buildings close so that we can help reduce traffic speeds and also prevent UDOT from coming in and
Yeah, just real quick, I think people take different perspectives and then argue them from those perspectives. My perspective was, at the time, working under Mayor Russell in the direction of the council, is that yes, the light rail discussion was going on, but we want to do something better with Main Street regardless, because the plan has always been calling for that. So the idea was, well, let's do something with Main Street. And I have to be honest, we knew that there was the idea of light rail, but the decision wasn't do this to get light rail. It was do this for Main Street. It's going to frame and do the things that we want it to make it the heart of the community. And this happens to open up that if light rail came, it's very supportive of the design. But if light rail doesn't come, it still accomplishes the heart of the city, the uniqueness, the heart, center of town. So if you look at it from, this was because they were occurring nearly at the same time. So you can look at it, say, I'm against light rail and the plan is associated with light rail. Or you can look at it and say, we were already underway with Main Street. This light rail potentially is coming, so keep that in mind as a fit and a supportive fit. And so I would agree, it wasn't a centroid theme of light rail.
Just let me interject. And I think that the overlay was tied closely to residential densities as a carrot to help make that happen. And I think that was on the verge of happening at Brighton Homes, and the citizens sent a clear message that that's not a price we're willing to pay to have that built environment on Main Street. And frankly, I think had during this ridiculous housing market right now, had that residential density stayed, we could have seen kind of a moment of, I mean, I was just down in Washington, St. George today, and everything's under construction, and you might have had that moment of, but I think the citizens spoke clearly through the election
they spoke
process,
clearly against the light rail, so the city came out
and
against the light
specifically against
rail.
residential density.
And then the density was added on top of that, and the citizens spoke pretty loud during Brighton's proposal.
Yeah.
So obviously, the temperature of the community subsequent to the adoption of the plan did not match what was
Interesting.
adopted.
I pressed each, for those of you who weren't there, I pressed each city council member individually, one by one, because
It was fun.
By name.
that was what I methodically do, right? And I asked each one, whether in their view Main Street was deteriorating and whether it needed revitalization. And I think everybody that I asked said in varying degrees, yes. I mean, I think that they are committed to doing something. I think that when we are considering vision, and of course our job is to plan independent of the city council, but I think we have to be realistic too as we plan. I think we're going to be able to make improvements to Main Street. I don't know that we're going to be able to get through a sweeping change to Main Street. Was sort of my perception coming out of that meeting.
Well, I'm excited to talk about Main Street for a second year in a row.
Second year in a row.
Well, I mean, like in
Yeah.
earnest, right? We've talked about it, but I think it'll be good.
I like this discussion, Corey, about the difference between the overlay versus the performance standards. I think that there's going to be more appetite for just design guidelines, right? Make the street look a little bit more homogeneous and maybe open it up to a couple of more uses, but otherwise not force people to move buildings and do a lot of different things with their existing space. And maybe we can get some synergy along that corridor over, a period of time if with some design guidelines, kind of similar to the Parish Lane design guidelines, right? That is a cohesive, pretty street. I mean, we've got a lot of commercial there, but it is very cohesive.
Right. And obviously, Main Street needs to look and function different than
Sure.
the parish. So we would tailor it to the specifics of Main Street and what we're expecting, and then that's the set of design guidelines.
Corey, so I came in probably after the bulk of the Main Street discussion, and I wasn't here last meeting. with your experience here in the city, are there a lot of potential developers that come and walk away because of the restrictions?
I would say from talk, not really. Now, that's going to be a mixed bag answer, because I would say overall, when you're looking at developers, because of the small lot plate numbers that are associated with Main Street, most of the development community is looking at, bigger places, more fluid places, and that's why the west side is ripened to the level it did and become whatever the market was willing to push to the city to do, and we responded accordingly with some vision, but it's different than the initial first vision of what happened on the west side. But I don't, the mixed bag is it was a little bit of struggle, because take the O'Brien site where Brighton came in. The O'Briens waited for a while to see what the city was going to do with the 2008 Main Street plan, and then went out and marketed their property accordingly. And it took a little while for them to secure somebody of interest. And that was Brighton Homes. And if you know Brighton's Homes, I don't know all of their corporate mantra, but I know their South Davis mantra. They want to be in the South Davis community. They've been primarily a residential builder and primarily single-family homes, and some of the history of the owners have been single-family homes. But they have known that there was market shifts, and so they started exploring as a company the multifamily residential. And when they came, they were not really yet ripened for the commercial. So the Bryans were able to track Brighton because they were a specific developer looking in the South Davis area that was primarily residential. We had the carrot of the residential. Brighton said, yeah, we like that. But some of the tensity or tense conflict is Brighton had not really grown to a company, from my understanding, into attracting and building commercial. Financial programs and all that's associated with it. And so they were heavy on the I'll go after the carrot part and less on the commercial part. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the biggest chunk of land, other than Jeff Cook, and Jeff has his ideas just across the street. And that's where you're going to still have developers looking for those larger pieces. It's really hard for somebody to come in and say, this little home next to a couple of homes next to Maverick, I'm going to invest in that and think of mixed use. That's a real difficult. So developers are looking for opportunities, but it's a niche kind of place.
I don't know if you can answer this question, but does the city or county, have they targeted anything along there that they need for any purpose?
They haven't. The city targeted, obviously, the move of City Hall over where, Iggy's was with the ball fields to Main Street. And that was a response to that 85 plan of trying to bring back the heart of the community. But, okay. That's been the discussion. I know Councilmember Fillmore early on explored talk at a council level as this plan developed about what it qualified for an RDA, which was a mixed really response from staff given the taxation issues and assemblage. I know she wanted to engage an opportunity to work with the property owner and see if they could assist in the marketing, but there's not really any targeted economic tools yet to Main Street.
All right, thank you.
Well, what do you think is the best way for us to proceed with moving forward, making sure that we are on the same page with the city council?
Well, I think from the standpoint here, obviously we can change and alter some of these statement issues and add. I heard a couple, the residential component coming back in, the east and west side coming back in and formulating some statements around that. But I think it really comes down to the general plan. My recommendation is that we still maintain an independent corridor plan in the general plan. Because right now, the east half is in the southwest neighborhood and the west half is in the southwest neighborhood. And so there is no cohesive neighborhood plan addressing Main Street. They each mimic each other, but it's not a cohesive vision. So I think the first thing is, the recommendation is that we ought to look at a corridor plan specific to itself and maintain it. It's obviously going to be very different than what's adopted right now, but we still maintain that corridor plan. You know, I think the second issue coming into being is what you brought up. Do we do an overlay, which is really meant to customize and relieve the base zoning to whatever extent you want to, and do something unique for that? And that's where your mixed use, your heavier design guidelines all came in to create that overlay, because that doesn't match the base CM zone development pattern. If the development pattern is riper for commercial with some added uses, you know, we don't necessarily have to use an overlay. We can get back to the design guidelines and write them twofold. One, what is it like for commercial, and what's the uniqueness than the generic commercial development layout, and create those design guidelines from them. The issue will be is where do you want to tag residential uses? And that can be tagged in a mixed use concept associated with the design guidelines, and instead of an overlay, and we just tag the residential uses that are in the use table. Instead of just saying CM for these residential uses, we would add whatever we're thinking the residential uses are, and add a tag that would simply say, see this section for the standards associated with it, rather than an overlay. You know, I'd be honest with you, from my perspective, when you hear the loosening and the soft commercial, and I think this goes back to these questions at the end, the very end, what's the threshold? Because if we have an existing pattern and we're trying to somewhat preserve that existing pattern, then the new overlay is essentially saying we don't want that pattern. Let's get away from that pattern and do something different. But you still have the issue of nonconformity situation. If you have a new set of design guidelines and you have existing development, where's the threshold to bring existing development to a new design standard? The typical Centerville ordinance has two parameters. One is, we have three types of nonconformities: use, building, and then site. So when we're talking about site elements and landscaping, if you're talking about building, we can tie building into structure, we can tie it into the design guidelines. But typically you're in these other nonconformities because your use is okay. Your building's okay, just in a general sense. But there's some changes you need to make to your site to be upgraded. And usually it's when you want to add 30% to your building. That's a typical place marker. You know, if you stay your building as is, you don't really have to come up to the design guidelines. We won't interrupt you with that. The other place you see the code kick in, and this is the question: change to a new use, change to the same use. These are threshold markers. So if you have an office and it gets sold and a tenant finish goes back to an office but reconfiguring the interior space, that's the same use. And generally most ordinances say, no, you get to stay the same because you're not doing anything. Our ordinance has some weak language. It says no when you change use, and this is the interpretive value. If I go from an office to a convenience store, for lack of better terms, that's a change of occupancy in the building code. And is that a change of use to bring yourself up to the new design standards?
Okay, but if a building is a dental office and then just becomes an accounting office, do they have to change?
Now, because that usually that's the question. From a building code standpoint, no. They fall in the same category. And that's where you'll see zoning ordinance kick in, is when you have to change this occupancy and get a new certificate of occupancy based on a new use. Yep, you have to upgrade. But no, from a dental office to real estate office or some other office, that falls in the same category. And most cities don't try to impede an existing use in any way.
So Corey, though, that goes back to, it's been a year or two since we were talking about the corner over here. going from, it was the Galaxy Frozen Custard to, it was gonna be a pizza place for a minute. And that was a change in use from specialty retail to general.
To restaurant,
retail,
fast
restaurant,
food.
Fast food. That was a change that was gonna require some stuff, not necessarily the full-on bring the building up to the street.
'Cause it was already
It's
there.
already there, yeah. But
So
that
they did-
otherwise would have required that.
Yes, and they had plans for all of the architectural upgrades
Yeah.
to meet the new form-based code design standards. They were required to do those upgrades. Fortunately, the building fell within the range, and that helped when we took property for the intersection change. It brought them within the build to range when we acquired more property for the Main Street intersection. So that was just one where the design became the upgrade rather than the moving the building.
Yeah, but I wonder if that isn't an issue for others that might be looking at some of that stuff
Yeah,
too. you
it could
know.
be,
Anyway,
yeah, could be.
Well, it sounds like first things first, which is to look at upgrading and making a different corridor plan. And I feel pretty strongly that we should keep it from Porter to Parish as opposed to Pages to Parish.
I agree, because I think the node system is kind of dead. I don't see that we're gonna see with the new, because remember, the nodes were created when Parish Lane was still Dick's Market. I mean, not Parish Lane, Pages Lane was still Dick's Market, and a Fresh Market was still,
Yeah.
and now Pages Lane has significantly changed. It's significantly changed in the southwest or southeast community plan, allowing the conversion to residential. So I think the Pages node is irrelevant. The residential boulevard district with the housing on the south of Porter wasn't for the uses, it was for the public space plan for the future along the street, the sidewalk width, the design of the park strip, and so forth. But other than that, the uses were kind of irrelevant. And now that we've had new investment to the Dick's Market, the new Dick's Market, you know, the idea is, are we going to convert that into a gateway in the next 20 years? And I would say there's enough life in that we'll find some upgrades and changes, but I'm not sure you're going to see somebody come in, assemble all of that, and bring in some residential.
Yeah, I think that's
So
right.
I think you're right. Parish to Porter is the real corridor.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that before
No.
we move to the next item?
On this, meaning the next item on the agenda?
Yeah, the next item on the agenda.
Yeah, and I would think just, if there are design guidelines that we really think are important, you know, I think those are gonna get peeled back, and we just need to be prepared to say, X is super important to me, and so those can be simple and clear when we get to that.
and why?
No, you don't need why, just kidding. Yeah, no, you're right, and why.
So just to summarize, I hear a couple of policy changes that follow up on the east and the west in the residential component. I hear a corridor plan being maintained in the general plan, and I hear a leaning towards performance design standards and the CM-based zone as a route.
Yes. At least that's yes from me.
I think it's a good starting point, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it can shift as we discover,
Yeah.
but that's our base.
Let's start there.
Yep, I
Base
think
point.
I think it's a good starting space. Okay, next on our agenda, we have some land use training. What hat do you wear? I'm really sad that Lisa is not gonna be here to see this one, but,
I think she is too, a little bit.
so, this is just a YouTube video, right, Corey?
She watches this in her spare time, so it's okay.
This is how she falls asleep. She watches
So she wakes up,
As he wakes up.
it's her coffee, yeah.
Now, does everybody know, why am I forgetting his name, our ombudsman? Brent Bateman. Everybody familiar with Brent Bateman, even by video, or he came here and
He
made
came
some
here once.
presentation?
Yeah.
Brent does a good job taking absolute boredom out of land use law. And so, you know, it's kind of quirky and corny at times, but Brent's doing a good job to try to bring some element that this, because the language of zoning is so starkly different than most everybody understands, that he really tries to do a good job. I do say that you'll hear some things that we don't quite do here in his presentation, and there are options to figure out, but I think he basically covers the basis of what should be done. Who's the speaker?
If you are a local government official and you're involved in making land use or zoning decisions, or if you work with those folks, what we're going to talk about today is the three most important things that you need to know. The decisions you make must be understood and handled correctly, or else you may violate someone's property rights or lose a lawsuit. Hello everyone, I'm Brent Bateman. I'm lead attorney in the Office of the Property Rights Ombudsman. And today we're going to be discussing what I think are the most important and fundamental aspects of land use decision making. The difference between a legislative decision, an administrative decision, and a quasi-judicial decision. If you are a city council person or a county commissioner, if you're a planning commissioner or staff, or if any of your duties in any way involve making land use or zoning decisions in your community, every decision you make is one of these three. But these decisions are all made differently. They have different rules, and most importantly, different effects. You know, the vast majority of local government officials that I know, they want to do the right thing. They want to follow the law. They want to protect people's property rights, and they want to make the best decisions for their community. Unless you're evil, we're talking about you. Understanding our discussion today is the key to doing that. In my opinion, knowing what type of decision you make is the first step in making the best decision. If you will remember your high school civics class, in America and in Utah, we have three branches of government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The legislative branch, which consists of our elected Congress. Their job is to take policy and make law. The executive branch, consisting of the president or governor, their job is to take the laws and enforce them. The judicial branch's job is to determine what the law is. Hopefully they're very smart, and their job is to interpret the law in case there's some kind of dispute. Locally, in your city or county, the same three roles exist, although they may be organized a little differently. There is a legislative branch of local government. Their job is to take policy, what the citizens in the community would like to see in their community, and to turn that into law. Those are local ordinances. The administrative role arises after the law is made, and it applies the law to different individuals or circumstances. For example, if a land use application is made, the administrative role is to apply the existing land use law to that application. And the quasi-judicial role is interpreting the local laws when there is a dispute. So let's talk for a second about each one individually and how it works locally. First, legislative. A legislative decision makes law. A legislative body does this by discussing widely applicable policy considerations and formulating laws to enforce those policies. What would we like to see in our community? Let's make a law to make that happen. Examples of legislative decisions include changing the general plan, adopting or amending ordinances, or annexation. Each local government has one body and only one body with authority to do this: the city council, town council, county council, or commission. No one else. And the standard of review is reasonably debatable that it advances the purposes of LUDMA. That's a low standard. A decision need only be reasonably debatable that it is good for the local community and it will be upheld. Next, an administrative decision. An administrative decision applies the law. There are no policy considerations in an administrative decision. There's no, is this a good idea, or does this work here? Those decisions have already been made and placed in the local code. An administrative decision takes an application and applies the existing law to it. Examples include subdivision, or a conditional use permit, or a building permit. An administrative decision can be made by any party that the legislative body appoints. Many administrative decisions are made by staff. Sometimes they are made by a planning commission, but they do not have to be. They can be made by any party appointed to the task. And the standard of review is substantial evidence on the record. If an administrative decision is supported by substantial evidence, it will be upheld. And finally, the quasi-judicial decision. A quasi-judicial decision comes into play in the case of a dispute, and it interprets the law. Every local government must appoint a person or body to handle this role, called a local appeal authority. Many places use boards of adjustment for this role, but that is not required. That's a quick overview of the three types of decisions and the differences between them. There are a lot of nuances we haven't discussed, but that's okay. This is enough to get started. Every time you make a land use decision, you have to think about the type of decision it is. Every time. If you'll do that, you'll greatly increase your likelihood of making the best decision. And hey, if you're going to make the best decision, hats off to you.
So I'm no Lisa, and I don't have any vacation photos to give to you, so I apologize. But I do have one question. I grew up hearing it quasi,
Quasi.
Quasi.
Yeah.
so I don't know
How
which
did
one's
you
right
pronounce
now.
it?
Quasi.
Quasar, yes.
Sounds like a Star Wars weapon.
Yeah, I know. Quasar you.
Quasi. Yeah.
But I can answer some generalized questions if anybody has any. I'm not your legal attorney, but I can give you my experience.
Any questions?
If you don't, just a couple of examples that have happened in Centerville. If you remember the Walmart and the issues associated with it, eventually the decision came down to the Planning Commission. It was an administrative decision associated with a conditional use permit. If you just objectively look at the record, there's arguments for and there's arguments against approving the Walmart. From a staff perspective, the substantial review was for, and we made a recommendation accordingly. One planning commissioner was asked to recuse, given some potential conflicts. So we had a 6-6, or a 3-3, but a 6-person commission. And it went a motion to deny, I think was the first one, and 3-3. And a motion to approve then was made, and it obviously came out 3-3. So the default factor is it failed to get a majority vote. So it's a deemed denial at that point in time for lack of a majority vote. That did go to the quasi. It went to our Board of Adjustment, and they reviewed it. And it came down to a 3-2 vote that there was substantial evidence to approve. What we did when that occurred at staff is to say, but look, the planning commissioners are better at administering the code of the zoning ordinance. Would you please remand it back to them rather than render Howard the approval? And they agreed to that, and it went back to the planning commission. So that was and I think Donna and I at the time, it was about 3,000 pages of information that had to be printed up for the record and so forth. And so the system worked. Now, I find it interesting, best decision. Well, you can ask some folks, and that's not the best decision. But from the implementation of the law, it became the best decision. And another place that I saw was Chair Heyman. I know I watched her with the public in her vote on a project. And, it's a place I've complimented, and I don't want to embarrass you anymore, but the best decision was different than the other best decision or the right decision. And Chair Heyman wanted some things to be different on the policy and was very vocal about what needed to change. And we did some changes. Maybe not to everybody's liking, but we did eventually do some changes to the law. But you did vote for the best decision in spite of the pressure you felt from the public. So you'll feel that from time to time as you serve, and where the public thinks the best decision is one way, but applying it properly is a best decision in a different perspective. And the tendency to say somebody's right and somebody's wrong, and that's the way we simplify and eventually create a victim story that we blame on someone. But the reality of it is it's perspectives, and it's not right or wrong. It's what should be done versus what we wished we could have done. So,
From my perspective, I learned a lot about the different hats that are worn and what hat the Planning Commission has when I was appointed to this body. And I think that it's something that the general public does not understand. And I appreciated the distinction so much more sitting on this side as opposed to being on that side and being frustrated when I'm giving comments and I feel like they're not being heard. And it's not that they're not being heard, it's that you can't
be considered.
they can't, right, they're not something that can change. And so I think that it's, I mean, we've talked about it before as a planning commission when people come in front of us to help explain what's happening. And I think that that whole process would have really benefited from before you open it up to public comments. If it had been very clearly explained to people, look, we know a lot of people have a lot of strong feelings about this, but let me just explain to you and remind everybody that you're welcome to provide comments, but we are very limited in what we can consider. And I think that could have, doing that type of education, I think it's important because, look, I mean, nobody but us and the few people who apply for things are ever in front of us. And so when something big like that comes up and people do feel passionately about it, I think that it would be good for us to help educate the public as to that distinction to avoid potential frustration and angst about my voice isn't being heard.
Yeah, the public, you know, they come and want to participate, and then it comes across, for lack of understanding of the full process, that their voice is a vote in an administrative decision, and their voice counts, but it can only count so far in the fact of really the voice is does this comply or not comply, is really their participation at that point, rather than we wished it was this way versus that way. And you just can't blame the public. This is a foreign land in land use planning. It's a foreign place.
Good, it's a good reminder, the different hats that we wear. So thank you for taking the time to do that. I think that this training will be helpful for us as we go forward. I mean, refresher courses. I know I'm guessing all of us are familiar with the different hats, but it's always good to brush up on the fundamentals. Okay, third item on the agenda, Community Development Director's Report. Corey?
We have an agenda. I think there's 4 items. I think a couple of them are internal. So Cassie, you were able to repeat them to me.
We have a conditional use permit for auto sales. We have Barris Cove final plat. And then Lisa's going to do subdivision chapter 5 with you guys. And then hopefully further along that Main Street discussion.
You were going to miss subdivision changes, Kathy.
Very
I think that you should
sad.
stay for that alone.
Crafting ordinance. And I don't recall from the last council meeting, I attended talking about the management of the city property on the hillside, but there was no items forwarded from the planning commission for that meeting.
Okay, great. And city council report.
Well, that was it.
That was it.
Sorry, I jumped
We always
in.
put those as separate matters, and so occasionally I
Have FOCA got
I'm a
rid of
dum-dum
them?
and
I'm not sure.
ask. Okay, and last item on the agenda is to review the meeting minutes for February 27th and March 13th. The February 8th, for those of you who weren't here at the last meeting, we tabled the approval of the February 27th minutes because we were really slim on a quorum, and bless Becky Wright's heart, she called in remotely in order to do the 2 pieces of business that we needed to do, and so we pushed this one off till this committee, or till this meeting, so. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll do this as par for the course, page by page. If you have any comments, let me know. Let's start with the February 27th minutes. So any comments or changes on page 1? Page 2? Page 3? Page 4?
Yeah, I
You
got
have
it.
2.
Yep.
Okay.
On line 18, we reference council member Wright. She is Commissioner Wright.
Little foreboding there.
And then on line 43, we have Commissioner Riggeth. Feel like I've seen that in an episode of The Office before.
Thank you. Any other corrections on page 4? Page 5? Page 6? Page 7? Chair will entertain a motion.
I make a motion to adopt the minutes of the February 27th meeting as amended.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Further discussion or debate? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. And moving to the March 13th minutes, again, page by page, starting with page 1.
Should probably put that I was absent.
Yes. Any other corrections to page 1? Page 2? Page 3? Page 4? The chair will entertain a motion.
Come on, Gina, your last meeting, you gotta do it.
I can do it. I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as amended.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion or debate? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Sorry, the second was who?
Logan.
Logan.
Thank you.
All right, and
I'll
seeing
make
no
a
further-
motion to adjourn.
I will second that. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.